Well, good morning, Westside. Hey, it is so good to be here with you. My name is Michael, if I haven't got to meet you before, and I am the groups guy here at Westside. One of the many privileges of my job is I get to hear reports from all of our groups and just how they're doing, things that are happening. And if it's okay with you, I would just love to share with you a few stories that I've heard recently from groups around the church that have just been good for me to hear, and I want to make sure you hear those as well. I heard a story from a group with a group member who was recently widowed and her husband had passed away, and just how that group had surrounded her and they cared for her and they came around her in that really difficult season. I heard another story of a group. They had a group member who was nearing the end of his life, and he was actually moved to hospice care. And so for a couple weeks, they actually met at hospice as a group. They moved their meeting location from here at church to hospice. Her story of another group that was just praying fervently through an infertility, through a battle with infertility, which many of you know way too well, and recently they got to celebrate a pregnancy. I was reminded of this personally recently in my own community. Recently we had one of the members in our community got married, and some of the guys, we got away and we celebrated him, and we had the opportunity just to pray over him and encourage him. And it was just one of those moments where I just sat back and thought, man, how important these relationships are to me. How important these guys in this circle are to me. And I am increasingly convinced that community is crucial to following Jesus. And I want to spend some time today unpacking what the Bible has to say about that, and also talking just a little bit about what's stopping us from entering that type of community, because I really do believe that connection in a community is closer than we realized. So let's jump right in. The first reason I believe that we were created to live in community is simple. Jesus modeled it. Jesus lived in community. Honestly, we could probably just pray and go home after that. Jesus did it, it's good enough for us, right? All right. No, I've got a lot more time. No. But Jesus modeled living in community. And here's the thing, Jesus was God. He did not need to be in community, yet he still models it for us. And if we look at the disciples that were around him, it was probably somewhat of a dysfunctional community that he was a part of. Let's just look at who the disciples were. I'm gonna read just the roster right out of Matthew chapter 10. It says this: here are the names of the 12 apostles. First Simon, also called Peter, then Andrew, Peter's brother, James, son of Zebedee, John, James's brother, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. So we can miss something today when we read this in our cultural context. So if we would have read this in that day and age, it would have read a lot differently. I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of them had descriptors after their name. And most of the descriptors were like so-and-so's brother or son of so-and-so, just so we would know who they're related to. But there are 3 descriptors, I don't know if you caught them, 3 descriptors in there that were kind of like titles. And 2 of those, one was Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector. Let me explain just a little bit why that's so important. At that time, the Jewish people were occupied by Rome, and they were under just a very intense Roman oppression. So the zealots were Jewish that were like, we don't like this. We don't want to be oppressed. We're going to try to secretly start to overthrow the Roman government. And some of the zealots were actually called men of the dagger, which this is kind of cool. They would hide daggers in their sleeves, and they would try to secretly assassinate Roman sympathizers and Roman officials in a crowd. They'd wait to be in a crowded area and they would assassinate someone and try to get away that way. That's how serious the zealots were about trying to overthrow Rome. And so you have Simon the Zealot. And in the same room over here, you've got Matthew the tax collector. Now, tax collectors were absolutely Roman sympathizers. Tax collectors were generally, in this culture, they were Jewish, but they worked for Rome. They worked for the government that was oppressing them, and they actually oppressed their own people, collected taxes from them, but collected more than they needed to, and they would scrape off the top. We might think about the IRS today. It is so much worse. I realize some of you work for the IRS, and we love you. We're really thankful that you're here today, actually. This is a whole different level of oppression. Their tax rates were just out of control. And so can you imagine what dinner was like? You got Matthew the Zealot over here, Simon the Zealot over here, and Matthew the tax collector over here. Today, when we think of like political polarization, we're thinking Republican, Democrat. It was so much more than that. Both of these guys probably had lost people they loved and cared about to the other side. Like, that's how serious this was. And that's who Jesus chooses to be on the starting lineup, to be his disciples. He is building this team that he's gonna go reach the world with, start the church with, start this movement with, and he chooses two guys that could not be from further ends of this political spectrum. I don't know if you noticed the third title descriptor that wasn't a family name. The third one was Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. I don't know about you. If you were gonna pick your community that you're gonna live in, do ministry in for the next 3 years, you're gonna do everything with this community, are you picking the guy who's gonna betray you at the end? Are you picking these political opposites that like talk about a like tense Thanksgiving dinner? Like, this is next level. Is that who you're picking to do community with? Yet that is exactly how Jesus models community for us. And in the Gospels, Jesus' call to follow him, the call to follow Jesus was always simultaneous with the call to join his community. Because we were never designed to follow Jesus alone. And that's my second big takeaway for this of why we're supposed to live in communities, that we were never designed to follow Jesus alone. Following Jesus is defined by a life of serving others. The way up in the kingdom of heaven and Jesus' kingdom is by becoming increasingly selfless, by thinking about ourselves less, by serving others. And it is impossible, I don't know if you know this, it is impossible to be selfless in isolation. Like, it is just literally impossible for you to be selfless in isolation. I think that's why Tim Keller says this great quote. He says, "You cannot know God apart from community." You cannot know God apart from community, because community is where we leave the sideline and we actually enter the game. We actually get around one another. We actually do the critical and hard work of loving each other, of making these relationships work. And Jesus is in this dysfunctional at best community. It wouldn't have been easy. Like, I'm sure there were times it was not always easy to model this type of community. Yet that's exactly what he does. Actually, in John chapter 13, Jesus is in the upper room. This is right before Jesus goes to the cross. This is like a crucial scene in human history. Jesus, they're about to share the Last Supper, all of this. And do you know how Jesus starts off that night? He starts off by serving. He starts off by washing his disciples' feet. Instead of running to the place of honor, he picks up a towel and he serves his disciples. This is the same night that Judas is gonna betray him. This is the same night that Peter is gonna betray him as well by denying him 3 times. And in this incredible scene, he washes their feet and then he dismisses Judas to go betray him. And right before he predicts Peter is also going to betray him, he shares these words. He says, "This is a new commandment I have for you." And these are just about as crucial of words as we have from Jesus. This is what Jesus says to them in that room. He says, "Dear children, I will be with you only a little longer. And as I told the Jewish leaders, you will search for me, but you cannot come where I am going. So now I am giving you a new commandment." And this is where we should lean in. He says, "Love each other. Just as I have loved you." And think about that. Jesus is about to go die for them. Like, I don't think they fully comprehended when he said, "Just as I have loved you." They're about to see a whole nother level of love. He says, "Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." Listen to that last line one more time. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. That's the way. That's how we prove to the world that we belong to Jesus. It's not by ascending to a place of power or debate. People will know that we belong to Jesus, not by any of those methods, not by arguing, It's by the way that we love one another. And by extension, we cannot love one another unless we are actually in community with one another. Otherwise, those are just pretty words that we say at church. We're like, yeah, love one another. That sounds like something we should do. And that's it. It's in that hard work, it's in that reality of actually being together that we do that hard but crucial work of loving one another. It is good work when we become selfless, when we become people of love. We become more like Jesus, that in his final meal with his disciples, he picks up a towel and he starts serving. He starts modeling what this looks like. And this is what makes Christian community so unique. The way the world models community is what you get out of it. Like, why are you a part of that? Like, what are you getting out of that? The church is the opposite. We say, what are you giving to that? How am I contributing to this? Because the world will know that we belong to Jesus by our love for one another. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. And our approach to community must look different because the world needs it. Because we were never designed to follow Jesus alone. The third reason I believe that this is just so crucial is that community is essential to a full life. In John chapter 9, Jesus says this: "My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life." He's talking about us there. That's the New Living Translation. The New International Version translates it this way. He said, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." If you were asked to describe a full life, a rich and satisfying life, I would be willing to bet that we all have some different descriptors of what that would look like. But I'd be willing to bet that none of us use the word lonely. Like when I'm thinking about having a rich and sad, I don't care how introverted you are, I would guess that none of us would say, yeah, lonely is one of the descriptor words I would use for a rich and satisfying life. And we all know that. And studies have shown just how bad loneliness is for our physical and our mental health. I thought about sharing some of those stats today, but when I looked at them, they were honestly so grim. I was like, that feels like a scare tactic, so I'm not even gonna share those stats. Because it is not a part of God's design for a rich and satisfying life. Yet, we live in a world that is increasingly lonely. We live in a world that is getting more and more lonely. Last year, the New York Post shared a study that said nearly half of all Americans, 49%, reported having fewer than 3 close friends. And this marked nearly a twofold increase since 1990. So in the past 30 years, we have gotten twice as lonely. In that same study, 12% of interviewees claimed that they have 0 friends today, 4 times as many as just 30 years ago. Our world is becoming increasingly lonely. But what's crazy about this is that we are more connected than ever. Like, we are more connected than we have ever been in human history. It's funny, I was doing this in first service, and I pulled out my phone, and like as I pulled out my phone, I received a text message from someone literally across the country. We are more connected than we ever have been, but we're lonelier than we ever have been. Because often we mistake connectivity for community. We mistake being connected for having deep, meaningful relationships. We have a ton of relationships probably that are about that deep. We have a ton of relationships with someone that we went to school with and we follow each other on social media and I saw what they did on vacation. But we have very few of those sitting across from the table having deep, meaningful conversation. Our culture has experienced a decline in meaningful relationships. But here's the good news. I know that was kind of grim. You all still with me? Like, we get it, Michael. Here's the good news. The church was literally built to be the solution. The way that Jesus set up the church, we are literally built for community. We have the hope that our world is looking for. The antidote to this kind of loneliness, our world, even if they don't know it, is hungry for that type of community, the type of community that loves one another, that cares for one another. So what stops us? What stops us from entering that community, from us taking that next step into community? And so I want to spend just some of our time that we have remaining just talking about two things that stop us from entering that type of community. The first is this. I am a millennial, and our generation got dubbed the FOMO generation. Are you familiar with FOMO? Anyone know what I'm talking about? Fear of missing out. You got to be involved in everything. Anyone ever experienced FOMO? 3 people, sorry. So Gen Z, the generation that's come behind us, they have once again one-upped us. And Gen Z, what researchers have dubbed as FOBO, which stands for fear of better options. This is actually similar to something Eddie shared a couple weeks ago with Camus, keeping my options open. And we shouldn't be too hard on Gen Z because it's not their fault. They're just simply a product of the environment that they were raised in. Let me illustrate it this way. I'll pick on millennials again since it's me. We were the generation, and I've made fun of myself for this. I've had other people say this to me. We were the generation that everyone got a trophy, right? Have you heard that? Everyone got a trophy. They're all winners. Who do you think gave us the trophies? Do you think I was 7 years old going down to the trophy shop after my T-ball league? I'd like one participation trophy. I know I didn't get on base all year, but no, it was just a product of the environment that we were raised in. And the thing about FOBO, that fear of better options, it has shown to be paralyzing to Gen Z, but we need to all realize it because that's just what our culture looks like. We all want that freedom to decommit at the last minute if something better comes along. We like to have options, but what we don't realize is that type of freedom, it doesn't lead to where we think it does. The world's model of freedom says things like this, that the heart wants what the heart wants, and my truth, and you do you. Or as the philosopher, Queen Elsa of Arendelle said, no right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. Thank you guys, that's the best service yet. Give yourself a round of applause. The problem with that is it's not true freedom. Paul in the New Testament actually would define that as closer to slavery than freedom. This is what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2. All of us used to live that way, following the passionate desires and inclinations of our sinful nature. Paul is saying that that's the old way of living, that we used to live that way, that we were following our passions and our inclinations. I love how Dr. Gary Brashear put it. He put, your strongest desires are not your deepest desires. Love that line. Your strongest desires are not your deepest desires. The things that I want in the moment, my strongest desires are not always the deepest desires, which are the things that I really need. They're the things that really do fill me. They're the things that really are life-giving and good for me. But I'm so often drawn to my strongest desires rather than my deepest desires. So how do we do that? How do we trade our strongest desires and pursue our deepest desires? I want to illustrate it this way, and I brought my jars. This is one of my favorite illustrations, and it's completely stolen. It's not mine at all. I stole this from a guy named Mark Sayers, and I have to tell you, Mark Sayers was a pastor in Australia, and so when he does this illustration with his Australian accent, it sounds so much more intelligent. And you're like, that, yes, I need that. So just bear with me. What he paints this picture of is 3 elements that we all need for what he calls human flourishment, to live that rich and satisfying, to live the good life. And the 3 elements are this. Well, I put them out of order. This will be fun. Freedom. We all need some level of freedom. If we have no level of freedom, we can't make decisions. We need some level to at least make decisions. It's like this. It's like the shell game. Purpose. We all need purpose. And I don't know where you find purpose from, but if you've ever been in a season of life, and it doesn't matter what season of life you're in, where you don't feel like you have purpose, you know that something's just a little bit off. You know that you're looking for that purpose in your life. And the third is community. And we don't need to spend too much time on this because we've already talked about we are designed to live in community. And here's the problem. I have water in all 3 of these jars. But what is true about life and our resources is that all of our resources are finite. Like we only have so much of any resource, whether it's our time, our money, our energy. And so we have to figure out how we distribute our resources. And so the thing about these is all these are good things, right? But if they get out of proportion, our life can get a little bit out of whack. Let me illustrate it this way. Purpose is an easy one. We all need purpose. We can all agree, like, we were created to work. We were created for purpose. A lot of us find purpose, or at least part of our purpose, in work. And that's not a bad thing. God created us for work. But if that gets out of hand and we start to fill this jar up, and we start to pour out of these jars into this jar, it can look like becoming a workaholic. And we've given up community, whether it's with our family or our church, and we start to give up community for more purpose. Or we start to give up our freedoms. We start being able to make decisions, and we have no margin because everything's going into the purpose jar because we've become a workaholic. And that's how all three of these jars are good things, but any of them out of proportion can lead to disappointment. What our culture struggles most with, I believe, is this freedom one, of not wanting to commit to things, of wanting to be able to pivot at the last moment, that we don't want to give up our freedom to get into these others. Or I think we disguise it at times and we actually overcommit to things, so we're not actually committed to anything. I don't know if you've ever been in one of these seasons where you're committed to so many things that you're having to bail on this to go to this, and then you're having to bail on this to go to that because you're so overcommitted that you've actually kept your freedom because you haven't really committed to anything. Let me share a personal story. Maybe this will illustrate it a little more clearly. If we spend very much time together at all, something you will probably learn about me pretty quickly is that I really love to watch football. It's just one of my favorite things. And it doesn't even matter what it is, like JV football in high school, I will go watch. College, NFL, AFL, like if there's football on TV, like I watch the NFL Combine. Like I love to watch football. But also if you know us, or you know the best versions of us, we love our small group. Our small group is one of the most life-giving things to me and my wife every single week. It is just good for our souls when we are with our people. And my role at Westside is the groups guy, so you would expect me to say that. What you might not expect is there are some Monday nights where there's a really good football game on, and our small group's on Monday nights, and they're all sitting right here and looking at me as I'm saying this. But there's some Monday nights where it's like, man, there's a really good game on. Maybe we don't do group and we just watch the game or something like that. But what we do on Monday nights at our house is that we've decided that community is more important. And we want to trade the strongest desires for our deepest desires. And so what we do is we give some of our freedom away. We take this freedom of our Monday nights and the freedom of what we're going to do on Monday nights and how we're going to spend it. And we take that and we pour it into the community because we know that that's our deepest desire. That we start to trade our strongest desires for our deepest desires because we know that's some of the good stuff. That's where we're going to start to grow. And I believe that FOBO or misalignment of any of these is what's stopping so many of us from entering community. You could probably start to fill in the blanks in your head and in your life how this applies to you. But this is a really challenging analogy to me every time I think about it, about what has gotten out of proportion in my life. The second thing that I think really stops us from entering into community is idealism. Idealism, I really believe, is the enemy of community. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said this: "He who loves his dream of community more than the Christian community itself becomes a destroyer of the latter, even though his personal intentions may be ever so honest and earnest and sacrificial." When we bring preconceived ideas of what a community should be, we can doom it before it ever begins. Let me illustrate it with this story. When I was in college, I was a part of a campus ministry, and that was a really important stretch of my life, a really important stretch of my faith journey. And when I was a part of that campus ministry, we lived in the same, I actually lived with some guys from my campus ministry in a dorm. We ate meals together at the cafeteria. We went to class. It was a small college I was a part of. We went to, all of our classes were in the same building. It was a very tight-knit community. And I'm very thankful for that. But if I left that season, because I had to graduate and grow up and get a job or something, if I left that season and I tried to project that image of community onto every other community that I joined, man, I've doomed it before I've even stepped in to that community. If I expected that every community I am, we're gonna live together and eat every meal together, that's just unfair, that's unrealistic. And when we breed preconceived expectations into community of what we're hoping to get out of it, one, we've lost track of Jesus's model of community, which is love one another, what you give to each other. But when we bring those preconceived expectations into community, we can doom it before it even begins. And this is something that I believe that we have to get right, because it also affects our most important relationship. And I'm gonna say this next statement, and then I'm gonna unpack it. So if this next statement you don't agree with, just wait a second, let me unpack it for you first. I believe this is so important because I think Jesus will not meet our expectations. Here's what I mean by that. I wanna illustrate this with a story straight out of scripture. There was a guy named Jairus. Jairus was a leader in the local synagogue, and one day his daughter got sick. And so he goes to Jesus, says, my daughter's sick, will you come to my house and heal her? And Jesus goes with him, and they're walking through this crowd back to his house. And this is shoulder to shoulder, it's crowded. And meanwhile, as they're walking through this crowd, there's a lady, and this woman has been bleeding for 12 years. And she hears that Jesus is gonna be around, and she gets this idea of if I could just touch his robe, if I could just touch Jesus' robe, I'll finally be healed. Scripture tells us she had gone to doctors, she had spent a lot of money, and nothing had helped. And so she decides, I'm just gonna get to Jesus. Her plan is to be super anonymous, touch his robe, get healed, get out of there. And so she gets there, and she touches Jesus' robe. She's able to get through the crowd, and she's healed instantly. But Jesus stops. And Jesus looks around and says, who touched me? And the disciples, who have got to be thinking, what are you talking about? Who touched you? Everyone is touching you right now, Jesus. We're in the middle of this crowd that we're working our way through. And Jesus said, no, who touched me? And the woman, realizing what's happened, she fell at her knees in front of Jesus. And Jesus, just so loving and pastorally, said, go, your faith has healed you. Meanwhile, some messengers had come and told Jairus that his daughter had died and not to bother the teacher anymore. Let Jesus go. Your daughter is already dead. And Jesus just looks at him and says, don't worry, just have faith. And when they arrived at his home, there was mourning going on, and Jesus tells everyone, she's only sleeping. Don't worry, she's only sleeping. And then scripture says the crowds literally laughed at Jesus. When he said she's only sleeping, they laugh at Jesus. And so he goes into the house, goes up to the room she's sleeping in, takes her by the hand and says, get up, little girl. And she heals her, and Jesus heals her. In both of these stories, Jesus did not act as he was asked to act. The ways that they were asking for help, this woman, she wanted to come in and be anonymous. She just wanted to touch his robe, get out of there, be healed, have her miracle. And Jesus stops and he pauses everything to show what God had done. I can't even imagine being Jairus, that in the middle, he is taking Jesus to his daughter. His daughter is dying, and Jesus stops to ask what seems like a silly question, who touched me? If my son was dying and I'm taking Jesus to my house, I'm pulling Jesus, being no, everyone's touching, we got it, my son is dying. But Jesus pauses. Jesus came through for both of them, but not how they planned. And so when we bring our expectations into relationships, it can doom it from the beginning. And so a question we need to ask ourselves is that, have I set unfair expectations in even my relationship with God? Because God is gonna act in ways that I did not expect, which is great because it means I'm not God. Jesus is gonna do his thing. And when we bring those preconceived expectations of how we're expecting God to respond when we pray, how we're expecting Jesus to respond when this situation happens, we can doom that relationship from the outcome. And to relate that back to community, have I set unfair expectations that have stopped me from entering community? Or have stopped me from remaining in community because it wasn't acting as I expected, or I was hoping to get this out of, and I left that community because of expectations that were unmet? Bonhoeffer also says this. I asked my wife how many Bonhoeffer quotes I could use, and she said 2. So here's 2. The person who loves their dream of community will destroy the community. But the person who loves those around them will create community. Community matters because people matter. If we have a heart like Jesus, we will look to create community. We will look to initiate it. We will look for someone to invite into community because people matter. God gave us this it is hard work. I don't want to make this sound like it's easy at all, but this hard work of loving one another. And so who do you need to invite into community today? How do you need to initiate getting into community today? Maybe it's as simple as you find 1 or 2 other people and you say, hey, let's just have lunch a couple times a month, just to the end of the year, just to check in with one another, just to see how each other are doing, just so that I'm being intentional about serving someone else, about doing life with someone else. I want to finish with this story. And it's a Bonhoeffer story, but she only said 2 quotes, so I think I can do a story. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer, was a pastor in Germany during the Nazi occupation, during World War II, a really tough time to lead a church, as you can imagine. And he actually formed this community that was going to form pastors, that they were going to do spiritual practices together, this community, and he wrote about this community. And it's incredible, some of the writings that we have from this. But one day, someone from his family came to visit him to convince him to leave. And what you need to know about Bonhoeffer is that he actually came from a very well-off family, a very well-known, they had successful business. And so his family saw what he was doing as kind of crazy. And so his family came to him and said, like, enough is enough. Like, we need you to come back to the real world. Like, this is all like too much. And Bonhoeffer said, let's go for a boat ride. And took him in this boat across this lake. And they pulled up on the shore and they walked up this little hill. And from the top of the hill, you could see 2 things. If you looked this way, you could see the community that he was leading, this Christian community that he was creating. And if you looked this way, you could actually see a Hitler youth camp. And so he pointed at the community that he was creating. And he said, this has to be stronger than that, pointing at the Hitler youth camp. That what they were doing here must be stronger than that. And that's why this is so important. Jesus said, your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. Not because we rose to a place of power, not because we have the best arguments, but the way we love one another will prove to the world that we belong to Jesus. And this community that God has entrusted us with is not just a nice add-on, but it is a vital ingredient to the hope that we offer the world. So let me finish today with just this simple question. How do you need to step deeper into community today?